Good morning, everyone. It's Thursday, which means it's Tap Talk. I am excited to be joined by my friend and the director and CEO of Plains Art Museum, Andy Mouse. We're going to talk about all things Plains Art Museum. So let's bring him on. Hello, Andy. Really? How in the
Hello,
world?
Dana.
Well, okay. Hold on. Let me do this. Let me do this. We'll see if this makes a difference. Okay. This is take two. We're just going to hope for the best. I'm a big believer in you just be honest about where things are at. Technology is technology. Let's do two things today, and well, three things actually. Let's talk about your holiday concert series coming up. I'm going to pull up this picture because you can see there's a cute little Christmas tree of some sort over there. So I know this is the holiday concert series. What can you tell us about that series? That's our first thing we're going to talk about.
Yeah, so that was one of the first things, when I became director of the museum. One of my first opportunities as far as introducing the history of a program. So I got to learn that the Plains Art Museum's Noon Holiday Concert Series has been going on for, I think, almost 2 decades, with the exception, of course, of COVID. So we had a couple of years where, obviously, the last 2 years we haven't been doing them. So we're bringing them back this year. There's a full week of good, as you know, Dana, this part of the world has, we're blessed in a lot of ways. And one of those ways is we have a lot of good musicians. And so we are, this is one of the ways that we engage our that pool of amazing musicians, and we play both traditional and contemporary holiday tunes and share good food, and they happen over lunch, so it's a nice break in the day in a way that our community comes together over the holidays. So 1 week in the middle of December, leading up to, of course, the right smack in the middle of holiday season, and leading up toward the end of the year.
Excellent. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to talk to you about. I want to then move on because you sent me some images, which I'm going to pull up, and you can just respond to them as I pull them up, Andy. But one of the core missions of Plains Art Museum is its Native American programming commitment to serving Native artists and getting Native art seen by the larger population. So let's look at this piece. What can you tell us about that program specifically and why it's so important to Plains?
Yeah, it's interesting that you pull up this one. This is a unique piece in a lot of ways. So this is actually on loan to us from LACMA, which is the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, through a program called Art Bridges, which is a foundation. We were able to access a dozen or so works from LACMA's collection, including this one, which is a screen print by Leo Limon, who is an Indigenous artist who makes contemporary works, but specifically related to indigeneity, like in Central and South America, around like Panama, what would be Northwest Colombia, and contemporizing those historical narratives in cool ways. So, which I think you see a lot within Indigenous art forms, particularly today, is there's this this recognition of history and elevating stories and narrative, but done in really cool and contemporary ways. So that's one thing that we're seeing. So this is actually a part of an exhibition called Below the Surface, which in part celebrated those loans from LACMA, but also was an opportunity to celebrate our 25th anniversary in downtown Fargo and the 10th anniversary of the Catherine Kilbourne Burgum Center for Creativity. So the way that we did that, so I know all that happened this year. So we really wanted to engage. So work at the museum, who work with all who teach classes in the center. We've never engaged this group before in helping create an exhibition, and so they helped us. They actually chose the works from our permanent collection as well as the works that were made available from LACMA. and those works are all shared in that space. And then they helped with the interpretation strategy. So it's very educational. It's like super accessible. So it's just a great combination of really, really sophisticated, meaningful work and really accessible presentation.
Mm, that's great because a big percentage of your staff are teaching artists. So, what a great way to engage them in the other arm of your work, which is presenting artwork both from kind of regional, but also much further afield. And I think I
Yeah.
misspoke a little bit when I said only Native American. It really is an Indigenous emphasis that you have taken on. So thank you for so kindly correcting that. That was really well done, Andy.
No, well,
Um,
it's only because you showed this specific example, which is, I think a lot of what we do is a celebration of Native American. You're not wrong. This particular piece, though, is really an expansion of indigeneity across colonial borders, which I think is really, really an interesting perspective. This artist is based out of Los Angeles, so they are based in the United States, but yeah, you see that kind of like we oftentimes um, think about borders as being solid, but they have moved over time. Cultures have moved
mm.
over time, and there's this really interesting sort of circular nature of time that is being reflected in some of these works.
Well, and just as a side thought, I think white people in particular tend to think of borders as being very solid and immovable. And what you often discover if you spend time with Indigenous art makers is that they just view time, not always, but often differently, or borders, or things that we as uh, primarily European descended people tend to view as very immovable.
Mhm.
There's much more fluidity in the way that they move through life and time in art making, which I think is a great challenge to all of us to think about the impermanence versus the permanence.
Yeah, absolutely. And isn't that's such interesting ground for museums to work in because we think so much about permanence.
Mm,
You
it's
know, it's
true.
like how we came to exist as entities, right? As it really as colonial constructions, but as entities that are acquiring artworks for preservation, right? So that they'll
Yeah.
be able to be accessed in 1,000 years and exist in the same condition as today. Is a really interesting intersection between worldviews and the way that we perceive time. I think is really, really compelling.
Mm. Well, also speaks to, I know that your predecessor, Colleen, he felt this way too, but this idea of getting art outside of the traditional walls of a museum or a gallery to engage people and getting all kinds of people inside so that again you're blurring the lines between this is a hard border of you are outside the museum or you are inside the museum, and some people belong inside and some people do not. That border has been decidedly blurred in your time for the better.
Yeah, I mean, I think about museums as being organizations, right? As being nonprofit organizations. So we
Mhm.
have we have assets, we have people, we have knowledge, we have programming, just like any other nonprofit. Just it's in this case really specific to artistic engagement, right? So I think the museum has taken some really cool steps in terms of being both a art viewing and art making place. And
Mhm.
that's of course, with the expansion of studio spaces and teaching artists and all of that knowledge that comes with them. But I also think that museums are doing places. Like we are places that do things.
Mhm.
So we are organizations that do things, right? Like we a place or an organization, I think is a really, maybe that gets to the root of it. But at any rate, one thing, for example, is, and this was just sort of a forced innovation. We within our Native American, or I should say, our Indigenous programs, our Director of Indigenous Programs has started a couple of things. One is what you're seeing here, which is an Indigenous art fair. it's coming up. It's on Saturday, November 19th. We can read it there, but from 10 to 5. That's a cool community event. Everyone is invited, and we have vendors who set up booths, and they're selling their works, and we have food, and it's a community gathering as much as it is anything else. It's really, really beautiful. And another thing which he did, which is start a podcast. So
Mm.
we have a podcast called Five Plain Questions, and we're doing less lectures through that initiative than we were before, in part because it's really grown into this podcast, which has a much wider audience than our lectures could ever have, right? And so that's a really interesting, I think, way that that museums. It's a very practical thing. Um, that but anyway, somewhat surprisingly, not a lot of museums are doing podcasts. So
Mm.
we're one of the ones that are. So I think, you know, these events, these community-based projects, we now have staff that are dedicated to just doing and participating and facilitating events outside of the museum. And then
Mm.
we have community events that take place inside the museum as well, and podcasts and other things. So I do think of us as being organizations rather than you know, places that have things.
Right, a holder of stuff.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. Andy, tell me about this piece.
Yeah. So she has a wonderful name because it's also seemingly a reflection of her as being a star. Her name is Wendy Red Star. She's
Mm.
a First Nations artist. Um, she's definitely a rising star in the museum world. This is a part of an exhibition called Continuity of Culture, which was organized by Joe Williams, who's our director of Indigenous Programs, and Amanda Height, who runs our print studio and our exhibition public programs. At any rate, it's cool. I mean, it very much relates to what we were talking about before, because so we have, for example, a traditional star quilt in our collection. That traditional star quilt and that star quilt pattern is reflected in this contemporary work by Wendy Red Star. So the exhibition is called Continuity of Culture, in part because you get a chance to see this sort of like diversity of expressions and across time and place, but all within Native American traditions and contemporary expressions, all in one exhibition.
Mm.
So it's cool. Anyway, it's also our first collaboration or partnership with Crow's Shadow Institute for the Arts, which is in Oregon, and this is what they do. They do artist in residence programming with contemporary Native American artists. So they've acquired all these amazing prints, and so it's you know, combining those. So this the title of it is I wrote it down here just so I made sure I didn't mess up the name. It's called Her Dreams Are True, Julia Bad Boy.
I'm sorry. Say one more. It's some what are
and that is
true?
from 2020. Her
Mm.
dreams are true.
Oh, her dreams are true. Oh, that's really, really fantastic. Okay.
Yeah,
So
she's really fantastic.
yeah, it's a beautiful piece. I apologize to anyone watching if you're having as hard a time watching it as Andy and I are getting through this. It's really disappointing. I think most of it's going to show up okay. Andy, what is here's $1 million question for about a 45-second answer. What do you think the future of museums is from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think about I think the future of museums is a little bit different than our past. I think the past has been about collections and about buildings, right? And I don't think that either of those two things are going to, you know, I'm not suggesting that they be diminished. I'm an and guy, so I see I see so much opportunity in museums in what we're able to do in communities. And that could be, exactly what we were talking about before. We were talking about how the museum has podcasts, how we're engaged in community events inside the museum and outside the museum. Um, I see that as being trajectory is sort of headed that way, that we're actually going to fulfill the promise that we are indeed community nonprofits. So
Mm.
that's where I see the future of museums as few places, as making places, and as community spaces, multicultural community spaces
Mm.
in particular. So I do think that I think we all know, like the museum world is interesting. There actually are some things that we all tend to agree on, and then there are some things that that I might have a slightly different view on than some of my contemporaries. But the particularly every museum in the United States knows that it needs to diversify its staff, board, and programming. I mean, if they don't know that yet, they're not
Get with
going
the
to
program,
be
people. Yeah,
sustained in the future.
right.
Yeah. So I mean, at this point, it's like that's pretty consistent. I think in what ways we use our resources varies between organizations. We're one of the few museums I think that actually our educational mission to the degree that we say as a field that we should.
Interesting. Yeah, your educational component
Mhm.
through the Catherine Kilbourne Center for Creativity is really one of the cornerstones of the community, because school children from all over are gifted with the opportunity to not just make art, but to make art in an art making space. And so that's really extraordinary in that sense. And then to have it be such a beautiful space. It used to, for everyone who is not aware, it used to be in the basement of one of our public elementary schools, which was better than nothing. But this is an enormous step up for students to be in these bright light art-filled spaces and have access to the museum on top of that. So, Andy, thank you for joining me. We're going to do this more often. I want to start talking with my museum leaders on a somewhat regular basis, because programs change and gallery exhibitions shift out, but also because I do think there is a real need to be constantly pushing the reason why a place like a museum is so important to a community, for its vitality, for its placemaking, for its history preservation, for its future looking, for all of those things. So next time we're on, audience, Andy and I will try to have a better connection, but the conversation will be as good or better. So thank you, Andy, for joining me. I appreciate your time. Uh, thank you
Absolutely.
to Thank you to 702 Communications for the support, as always, of Tap Talk. And everybody else, I will see you next week. Nicholas, thanks for the shout out. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.